very warm welcome to today's webinar covering Ethiopia. My name is Philipp Schweers. I'm an Associate Fellow of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, associated with the Conflict, Security and Development Research Program. Today, we would like to take a deeper look at the escalating Tigray crisis in Ethiopia. And I think we do have quite a lot to discuss following last weekend's events. I'm joined today by a very impressive panel with three and actually four people discussing today potential regional notions and conflict dynamics. First of all, I would like to welcome Pat Thaker. Pat is Director for Africa and the Middle East at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Pat has an impressive track record of analyzing cross-regional dynamics. She has been chairing multiple conferences relating to food security, macroeconomic dynamics, and conflict-related developments across the further region. Also with me today is Professor Clionadh Raleigh. She is the director of the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, to those of you who have been in touch with this. She's currently based in Addis Ababa and supported by her colleague, Braden Fuller, who is leading the Ethiopia research stream of the ACLED research work. Clionadh is also a professor of political violence and geography at the University of Sussex. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Sandy Wade, who is a former soldier and diplomat, and who has been working in and on Ethiopia for more than a decade now. Initially starting as a defense attaché, and later with the EU delegation to the African Union there, he has been joining the European Institute of Peace as a senior advisor on Ethiopia since 2017. Before we take a deeper look at the underlying root causes and dynamics relating to the current Tigray crisis or the escalation of it, I would like to outline quickly the order of play, as well as some basic housekeeping rules. So concerning today's webinar structure, we will have, for each panelist, we do have around 5 minutes of an opening statement, followed by around 45 minutes of question and answers. Concerning housekeeping, you have two options, and I would be very glad if you would join our discussion in the coming 60 minutes. You have the option one, which is the Q&A field, which you can open in a window and where you can type in your question to the panelists, which I can then see and raise accordingly. Secondly, you got the option to raise your hand, where I will see yourself basically positioning yourself, and we will make sure that your question can then can be audible to the panelists. I would like to ask you to, first of all, since we are bound to the 60 minutes maximum, I would like to ask you to limit your question to one only. And if you raise your hand and would like to take part in the discussion, please again limit yourself to one question and not to a statement. Thank you very much. I'm really eager and looking forward to the discussion which will follow now. And I would like to hand over to Pat Thaker in her introduction statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. And firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to this very topical and joining very credible panelists as well. My opening remarks will be very much centered around what we're going to discuss for the next hour. I would say this is by far the most serious crisis of PM's Abiy's difficult 2.5 year premiership that has won him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 for a peace deal with Eritrea. He's overcome an assassination attempt and an attempted coup as well. So where does he go? Now he finds himself on the cusp of a civil war. At the heart, I would say, of the conflict lies the issue of control of Ethiopian economy and political space. These are the two most important criteria across the spectrum. There's no question, very little love lost between the regions of Amhara and Tigray. And as part of Abiy's One Ethiopia vision, the recent loss of power has come as a shock to the TPLF, which ran the country for almost 27 years. So it was their ego, but also losing substantial power at the central force as well. Federal government declared a state of emergency in Tigray in November and ordered the troops in to restore law and order. And as we expected, it would be sort of swift and pretty brutal as well. They wanted to conclude it very quickly. And as we've seen that over the weekend, that the federal forces secured a major objective by taking control of the regional capital. But, this is a big but, this is unlikely to be the end of the troubles for the PM or Ethiopia as a country. TPL forces have withdrawn from the capital and highly likely, nothing confirmed, to have moved to South Sudan, but pretty much an ungovernable place, and do not intend to give up easily with their loss over the weekend and in the recent weeks as well. So the search to capture the TLPF leaders and forces is on. And also equally at the same time, efforts to restore Tigray have started. This is very, very important. Equally, the government will attract international criticism for the massive destruction caused by heavy shelling in the last 2 days. It will require emergency food aid along with healthcare support. A large number of people have been displaced in the state, and this also includes Eritrean refugees from camps in northern Tigray. And the government will soon ease access to the region and allow international aid agencies across the region access to the region. This has been very much a sticking point as well. We expect internet and telephone access will not be restored immediately. That will take time. So it'll be very much a controlled access. Even before the current crisis, it's important to remember where Ethiopia stood. It's the continent's second most populous country after Nigeria. And it was already passing through a transitional phase that has brought with it a heightened risk of social unrest and tremendous instability. As I said earlier, assassination attempt, coup attempt as well. Both political and economic reforms have been the foundation, the mandate, to produce a more representative and accountable government. At the same time, develop a more dynamic and open market economy. Pretty ambitious, building trade and investment with East and West, attracting foreign investment to strategic sectors, and basically overall raising the living standard for almost 110 million people. These are pretty ambitious, lofty ambitions of the current administration. At the same time as the rest of the world, 2020, the growing pains of the country, politically and economically, I would say have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which points to very much a difficult backdrop for Ethiopia to achieve its desired goals while maintaining peace, stability, and possibly even a unified country. This is about developing one Ethiopia. And this is at the core of what is going on in the crisis at the moment. That's it from me, Philip.
Thank you very much, Pat, for this condensed though very comprehensive perspective. I would like to hand over to Clionadh, currently in Addis Ababa, who is joined by Braden Fuller, possibly able to give us, a ground perspective on the things happening right now.
Happy to. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. The first thing I think that it's important to say is that there's a real disjuncture between the international information about this conflict and what people are saying on the ground. And it's not necessarily even a function of the lack of information coming out of Tigray. It's really about the concept of this conflict. The government has made it very clear that it did not consider Tigray an equivalent or parallel force. Meanwhile, Tigray has, I think, done an extremely effective PR campaign, of which many international analysts, media, and academics believed them to be, if not as strong as federal forces, then stronger. And to be honest, I don't believe that there's any reason that we should have believed that. They were bluffing. They were simply not anywhere near as strong as they were claiming to be. And I think the fact that they have neither won any significant battles, nor were able to hold out for more than a little bit over 3 weeks, really reinforces this. And of course, it was a quick war, and it will be a long and costly occupation. I don't think anybody's in any two minds about that. But I would say that the concerns about insurgency, which have now become the next stage, I think also we should take those with a grain of salt. The TPLF have simply not managed to prove themselves to be an effective fighting force, either within Tigray or even outside. So whereby I think they might give a lot of lip service to supporting, let's say, harming Abiy through about 1,000 cuts. I don't think we've seen any evidence of their abilities to do it. Now, that said, I think everybody should be very aware that the problems in Ethiopia are very much beyond Tigray, although that is its dominant issue at the moment. And in fact, some of the conflicts that are happening in the south of the country, in a place called Konso, or those that are happening in the west, in Benishangul-Gumuz, they in fact have been ongoing and quite difficult, and I would imagine accompanied with the OLF, really will represent some of the major challenges to Abiy as he seeks his re-election. I just want to make a point about that. Abiy really has secured his re-election in this quick victory in Tigray. In fact, and support for this conflict was incredibly high. Despite what the public attitude might look like on Twitter. So I would say that we should look at this from the perspective of a government in which they had been, I would say, giving the TPLF quite a lot of rope for themselves to be far stronger than the TPLF in this case. I think that they will be an effective force in dealing with the violence across the country in the coming months. But I don't think there's any doubt that we are seeing a new side of the Prosperity Party and the Abiy government, and that will be a much more repressive side. I think the honeymoon is certainly over about the regime in general, and he'll be a lot clearer kind of law and order campaigns across the state. The one thing that I would like to mention very quickly is that, in fact, the one thing I'll mention very quickly is that the occupation that we referred to earlier in the Tigray region is potentially going to be done by Amhara administrators and Amhara militias, which will exacerbate the problems there. There's no question about that. And in fact, I would say that that should be our new TPLF. There are real concerns that the TPLF doesn't necessarily control their militias in the Tigray region. And if that is the case, I think that it will really come down to a contest between Amhara and Tigrayan militia forces. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clionadh, for your excellent local perspective. Dear participants, dear audience, as you can see, it's great having someone joining our discussion from Addis Ababa, but at the same time, we have been encountering some bandwidth/internet challenges here. So that is the reason why we had to temporarily stop the video feed coming from Addis, because it would have been otherwise affecting the sound / the voice of Clionadh. Thank you very much again. Here, I would like to hand over to my dear colleague Sandy Wade, who will be sharing his opening statement now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Philip. Yeah, so perhaps to go back a little step to the beginnings of this conflict and what has caused it to be what it is, and then to say a few comments about the ENDF and the TPLF to then lead into questions. But I think one of the most important points to bear in mind when looking at this from an international point of view and who has influence is that Ethiopians do not like being told what to do. And this counts for all sides. The TPLF have not changed overnight, just because they appear to be on the losing side in a conflict that is arguably of their own making. And the Prosperity Party is an evolution and not a revolution from the EPRDF. So from that point of view, the international community has lots of experience of dealing with both sides of this conflict and knows the protagonists well. Much has been made, as was mentioned earlier, by the Ethiopian government and others, of the need not to deal with the PP and the TPLF as equals. And it's clear that the federal government of Ethiopia is a step above the regional government of Tigray, if you look at those functions, and that they are not equivalent organizations, nor with the same responsibilities to the populations of Ethiopia as a whole, the PP, and Tigray alone as the TPLF. Ethiopia is the only empire in the world that went from being an empire to a country without breaking up. And that process of becoming a country is what we're seeing now going on. That transition from being an empire and how an empire is run to being a country and how a country runs itself. Since 2018, there's been a growing enmity between the TPLF and the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. And this began to be most obvious with the dissolution of the EPRDF, the creation of the TPLF, and the creation of the Prosperity Party, a creation of Abiy Ahmed. COVID-19 intervened, and it's important to see that COVID has had a direct effect here. And the delay in the national elections, first from May 2020, which was due to instability in Ethiopia, until August 2020, and then the COVID delay until May, June, perhaps 2021, the date's still actually to be TBC, gave the TPLF the opportunity to hold their own election in September this year, and to then claim legitimacy above that of the Prosperity Party. This was followed by a series of demands by the TPLF that were unacceptable, in genuinely unacceptable terms. Had they been accepted by PP, it would have meant the end to PP and their ability to rule Ethiopia, because they would have been saying, okay, we bring in an interim government, we bring ourselves out of government, we keep the TPLF as a part of the driving political force in the process of moving forward in the democratization of Ethiopia. That would not have been acceptable and cannot be acceptable now, I believe, to ordinary people in many parts of Ethiopia. So this started the slide into armed conflict. The election in Tigray, in which the TPLF took 100% of the 152 seats that were actually up for election, there were some others that were up for selection afterwards, with a 98% turnout, will also have led the TPLF into believing their own propaganda about their popularity and their irreplaceable nature in Tigray, and will have contributed to their calculations and miscalculations in their demands of the federal government and of their own strength in Tigray. The TPLF, having opened the conflict by their own admission, it's now unacceptable, as I said, because to do so would probably collapse the Prosperity Party and the government, to do any form of deal with the TPLF that would result in them continuing as a political force in Ethiopia. International calls for mediation and ceasefire, therefore, are falling on very infertile ground. However, what the international community can, and I believe must, demand from both sides, in the interest of humanity and in the interest of an awful lot of Ethiopian civilians who are being caught up all over Ethiopia in the fallout from this conflict, is that both sides and all individuals involved in this armed conflict abide by domestic and international law and obligations, for instance, to civilian populations and to refugees, but also to opposing combatants. And you'll have seen pictures of the pilot of an Ethiopian MiG-23 that was shot down supposedly over the weekend, may have been earlier, who knows, captured alive. Hopefully he remains that way. And if he doesn't, it's a war crime. And with a very clear statement that those that have not in the past and do not in the future meet those legal obligations must and will be held accountable. So my guess, therefore, is that the government of Ethiopia, using the ENDF and associated regional police and special forces, police special forces is an easy to misunderstand term in this context. They will continue to operate against the TPLF and its forces until such time as they put the majority of Tigray, including Mekelle, back under federal government control. And will then install the interim Tigrayan administration that has already been constituted. This is likely still to be under a 6-month state of emergency in Tigray that has already been declared. And therefore that interim administration will continue to be supported by the ENDF. What remains of the TPLF in Tigray at that point remains to be seen, but I think it is now clear that the TPLF will not be registered as a political party for national elections due in 2021. And therefore, a post-TPLF Ethiopia is currently in the making. And I think that's an important point for the international community to understand. A few words on the ENDF and the TPLF forces and capabilities, on which I'm happy to expand in questions. The regular volunteer forces of the ENDF are small. They number about 135,000. Of those, a significant proportion remained in Tigray, covering the Eritrean border, even after the rapprochement with Eritrea. And even when troops may have been redeployed to other internal security or UN and AU peacekeeping missions, a significant proportion of their heavy equipment remained in Tigray. The proportion of fighting troops in the ENDF of Tigrayan ethnicity is often overstated. It is roughly in line with the national population at about 6%, which means across the whole of the ENDF, about 8,000 Tigrayans, only a proportion of whom will have been in Tigray. And we can see that with actions in Amisom to take Tigrayan soldiers out of operations and hold them to one side for the moment. In those current operations in Tigray, the ENDF have been backed up by the federal police and by the regional special police special force of Amhara and Oromia in particular. The TPLF, in line with other regional states in Ethiopia, rapidly built up their regional special police, Liu police, often referred to it now as special force. And this is a term that's being used very widely across Ethiopia, Liu Heil. Built up over the last 2 years, this has formed effectively the armed forces of each of the regions of Ethiopia and is very dangerous. This is in Tigray was raised to an estimated number of somewhere between 30 to 50,000 personnel. And that would have formed the basis of the TPLF's regional fighting force. Supported by the long extant network of local village militias, of which there are about 160,000 across the region, but they are at village level. Supported also by TPLF youth members across the region. Although having no heavy weapons of their own before the conflict started, the TPLF, of course, knew what capabilities were held by the ENDF and where, and they appear to have been careful to have grabbed at least a proportion of the key equipment, tanks, air defense missiles, rocket artillery, ballistic missiles in particular, both for their own use and to deny them to the ENDF. It's not surprising that some ENDF equipments, such as rocket launchers fired at Asmara and at Bahadar, have gone unreported, as have UAVs. The Ethiopians have operated UAVs since at least 2007. The ENDF are masters of operational security, or OPSEC, and it's equally unsurprising that the TPLF knew what systems were where and could operate them, given the presence of Tigrayan senior ENDF officers, both serving and retired, in Tigray, some of whom have proven still to have TPLF connections. So to finish, given that the international community has few levers to influence the internal state of affairs in Ethiopia, as opposed to regional affairs around Ethiopia, where they do arguably have more influence, the international community can and should demand from all sides that international laws and obligations are honoured, and that those directing and operating on both sides will be held accountable for infringements, and should very strongly encourage media access to Tigray and to the Ethiopian government's operations in particular. And there are some extremely good media based in Ethiopia who are having difficulty doing that job at the moment. And it would be good if the Ethiopian government were to realize that better reporting would come from better access. As the African Union's envoys have proved to have access, they saw Abiy over the weekend, and may have influence with the Prime Minister, they should also be strongly supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for this impressive insight. Much appreciated. So we are closing now our initial phase, including the opening statements of all panelists, and I would like to move on into towards the question and answers. I already see the first hands being raised, and I would like to ask Owen Green from the University of Bradford to join the discussion and bring up his question.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thanks. Thanks to the panelists. The question is really asking for further elaboration and clarification of a couple of points. Firstly, in relation to Pat's contribution, thanks very much, Pat. But Benishangul Gumuz and Konsa, they've always been sort of low, violence issues for some time. Yes, and I wonder whether you could elaborate what you quite mean when you're referring to conflict elsewhere as being particularly risky. And in that context, also there are obviously bigger tensions. I wonder how far Abiy is actually carrying all of Oromia, for example, with his agenda. But then secondly, Eritrea and the Sudan border hasn't really been addressed yet. Obviously, Eritrea has been high profile in supporting Abiy's sort of response to TPLF. But I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit further on how you see that evolving now that the government has, in a sense, in a traditional military sense, secured the capital, and particularly in terms of arms flows to potential TPLF rebels, militias, as they go forward.
Thank you very much, Owen. I think this question goes straight to Pat. Would you like to answer accordingly, Pat?
Yeah, of course. A very relevant question. You're absolutely right. I would say the government is really still facing, both internally, regionally, and sub-regional as well, serious challenges. One of the questions that could be raised is, can this prolong the low-level insurgency in the sub-regions as well, especially the populous Amhara or Oromia regions? Amhara has been very supportive of the federal government's moves in the current crisis, very much directing its troops to fight the conflict, and they're not expected to change their position at all. They're very much behind the government. Abiy has ensured since the start of the conflict and since coming to power that he has dismissed several prominent Tigray army generals and replaced them with Oroma and Amhara officials, trying to go towards one Ethiopia across all the spectrums. Similarly, he has awarded positions in the cabinet, ministers to people of different ethnic origins, ensuring that no community is marginalized. And this is with a view to long-term sustainability within the country and the sub-regions as well. You mentioned something about Eritrea's position. Eritrea has also equally been totally behind the federal government's move in the recent crisis. It really does not want to jeopardize its long-standing war that it had between the two countries, and that has come to an end, which won him the Nobel Peace Prize as well. So it's very keen to keep moving in that direction. The big question mark is, of course, Sudan. And given Sudan's current position, it is well positioned to mediate in the conflict. It is also possible, like I said, TPLF is trying to seek asylum in southern Sudan. And if by providing asylum to TPLF leaders, the interim government will be declaring war with Ethiopia, technically. By aligning with the federal government and cutting off any potential support, flow of ammunition from its eastern states into Tigray, the Sudanese interim government can influence the government in Addis Ababa to resolve a long-standing border issue in the Fasqua region favorably as well. So you can see that Sudan really does not want to be directly involved in this conflict. It is just turning a corner and coming out into the open in the international community, particularly since its recent recognition, diplomatic recognition of Israel as well. After 3 years of battling economic recession, a whole year of protests and decades of internal conflict, Sudan's economy, politically, socially, is in dire situation. And the last thing they want is to be dragged into the neighboring country's conflict. So you can see recently, all the African governments as well were not openly supporting, but certainly not criticizing what's been taking place in Ethiopia as well. They're fully behind the federal government, what they're doing, and saying this is an internal affair and it should stay as that. So is that fine, Owen?
Yeah, thanks very much. That's absolutely fine. I basically agree with you. On the other hand, Sudan and all of those things, but I think that the government of Sudan, obviously, as you say, in the eastern area and in particularly, doesn't, it has pretty flaky control. So I wouldn't put it beyond having arms transfers. But I agree with you, the big messages very much. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Pat, and thank you very much, Owen. I would like to, I actually see a couple of hands being raised now. Before going forward in getting the attendees involved, I just have another question for Clionadh and Braden, being based in Addis Ababa, because we already touched a bit on the regional dimension. We already looked at what this might, how this might impact other areas of Ethiopia. And with your research work, the ACLED work you have been doing across the region, I would love to hear your perspective on how the Tigray conflict could actually, in your perspective, impact other areas of Ethiopia, and how you would see, the potential conflicts in Ethiopia as such, potentially escalating due to the current law enforcement operations.
Thank you very much. I do want to, we will address that, and in part something that was said by Owen earlier. I do want to be really clear here that the violence that's happening in Konso, in Oromia largely, and in Benishangul-Gumuz is actually incredibly intense, and it's not the type of typical violence that you would normally see there. There is a projected internationally displaced population of 95,000 from the last week in Konso. It's not a small conflict. It's actually on par in some ways with what people expect to come out of Tigray. So I think that you've seen a rise of conflict in many areas across the state, both before and since Abiy has been in power. And in fact, Tigray up until very recently was very quiet. And I'm going to pass it on to Braden now, but I would say one of Abiy's real issues at the moment is trying to figure out how to have his pan-Ethiopian ideology work with, as mentioned earlier by Sandy, military and security units that are very much based around an ethno-national dimension. And they may have been allied for this issue in Tigray, but they are not allied when it comes down to what's going to happen next. Braden?
Exactly. We at ACLED have been tracking these conflicts for several years and can speak a bit as to the dimensions. As far as the intensity of the conflict, we have seen an increase in, well, you know, these border conflicts around the Oromo-Somali border, the Benishangul Gums area with the border with Amhara region. Other locations across the country, we've seen these conflicts been running for many years, but they have intensified. And this, you know, could be in part, as many in the government here in Ethiopia have said, is that the TPLF has been engaged in destabilizing the country and encouraging these conflicts. And that's certainly something that we'll come to see as the TPLF has lost its base in Mekelle. We may see a decrease in conflict. More likely, I think we'll see an increase as actors, the OLF, different regional militias engage in these border disputes, and it increases as actors are trying to gain control of territory. And especially with the upcoming elections, we are a bit concerned about increasing violence across the country and not just in Tigray region.
Thank you very much, Clionadh, Braden in Addis Ababa. Before we look at more regional or less, or let's say economic perspectives or implications, I would like to take a quick step back and would like to involve Sandy here on the origins of the Tigray crisis. Actually, we've been already hearing quite some comprehensive perspectives on regional implications, on economic and humanitarian perspectives. But Sandy, could you take a look at what actually is fueling the current civil unrest in the Tigray region? And what is actually triggering, or what has been triggering, the recent escalation? Would you like to get involved here, Sandy?
Yeah, yeah. So I think there are two separate elements of this, which is important to see separately. One is what is happening between populations on the ground, and for instance, the massacre at Maikadra. You can see as something that has happened with some element of encouragement politically, but without actual direction. Whereas there is the attack on the ENDF and the fast formation of what one might call the armed forces of Tigray under the TPLF. As an immediate sort of follow-up to that attack, is a different issue. I think of the two, the more dangerous is the ethnic issue, the inter-ethnic violence. And I think it is clear that there have been outbreaks of inter-ethnic violence in Tigray with perpetrators from both sides, both from an Amhara side against Tigrayans and Tigrayans against Amhara, and then bringing into that the other ethnic minorities that are there. And there is some reporting of another massacre in the Raya Valley in the border with Afar as well. So I think this will have happened in numerous places, and I think this is the most dangerous part of what is happening, and it's the thing which could flow across into the rest of Ethiopia. And the thing that the government of Ethiopia and under Prime Minister Abiy must act to prevent. I think the point, or the term that was used just now of Amhara troops, if you think also of Oromo troops, there is no such thing as Amhara troops or Oromo troops. The ENDF is multi-ethnic. They have no ethnic units. So they have no units that are going to naturally fight each other. The Amhara have their special force, their Liu Heil. They are policemen, and they are constituted as policemen. But they're policemen who are wearing camouflage uniforms, armed with machine guns, and are given military roles to take on. That is the most dangerous thing that's happening in Ethiopia, because it has effectively produced, as quoted, the armed forces, the troops of Amhara and the troops of Oromia, whose sole function if you look at it as a troops function rather than a policing function, can only be to defend their region against the region next door. And there comes a point with all of these things where defense turns into offense. And the TPLF's comment that we carried out a preemptive strike because we're going to be attacked just exactly illustrates the dangers of that. So, so maintaining that, maintaining a blanket over that so that it doesn't take off, so that those flames can't take off across the rest of Ethiopia, is probably the biggest challenge for the government. So if you look at Western Tigray at the moment, and in terms of the beginnings of this Tigray-Amhara struggle that's going on at the moment, Western Tigray used to be part of Gondar, an administrative region run from Gondar before there was an Amhara. Of course, if you lived in Gondar, you probably were Amhara, and you considered, therefore, what is now Western Tigray to be part of Amhara. It will be interesting to see how the Ethiopian government manages in future, constitutionally, I presume through some form of constitutional review process, to resolve the issues around Western Tigray in particular, but that will in itself raise issues with other borders around Ethiopia. Will there be a new arrangement of the administration of Ethiopia? If there is, and it appears to threaten, for instance, Oromia, that will be very, very unpopular in Oromia. If it appears to give a large part of Tigray to Amhara, that will be very popular in Amhara, but very unpopular in Tigray. So there are some very, very difficult things to come. They're to come after the election, I think. But there needs to be a process through which those things are dealt with by talking and not by fighting. But all of the bits necessary for it to be done by fighting have been put in place and need over the next couple of years to be dismantled in the form of the special force, the special police.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sandy. Before I hand over the words to another attendee, I'd like just quickly to check with Pat concerning the origins of the conflict, basically, and the triggers, the fuel, what keeps it going and what keeps it escalating. You know, what is your perspective coming from a different angle, coming more from a research slash economist angle? How would you perceive things?
I agree with Sandy on most of the elements. It's the complex ethnographic makeup. It's not going to disappear just because the crisis is going to go, conflict is ending, a low-level insurgency will continue. There's no question about it. They've opened up a Pandora's box, which is not going to be very easy to close quickly and well, at least for the foreseeable future. And yeah, the federal forces are likely to take a much stronger, aggressive stand against any instability that takes place in the country and beyond its borders as well. 2 or 3 things, though, I would say you need to consider. Firstly, if Oromo are denied proper political representation in the 2021 elections, or do not see tangible benefits in the short term, then you could see another 2016, 2018-like protests taking place as well. And secondly, if Abiy allows Sudanese government to retake Fashwa Triangle, the Mara farmers who feel strongly about this will also protest. And also another area which has been the new elephant in the room this year, which remains unresolved, is the rising tension between Egypt and Ethiopia over the issue of the giant dam on the Nile. So this is another element that the Ethiopian government was facing in terms of its challenge with its neighbors. It's going to transform the economy for Ethiopia and its neighbors. Definitely the dam has, but potentially it's very bad news for Egypt's very massive water needs. So those are the 3 elements you need to think about as well when you're looking at the major challenges facing Ethiopia in the coming months as well.
Thank you very much, Pat. I'm seeing a couple of hands here, so I would like to ask Yogendra Kumar to join the discussion and just quickly introduce you, raise your question, and if possible, also identify the panelist you would like to discuss your question with. Welcome, Yogendra.
Well, thank you. I'm calling from India. I'm unaffiliated to any organization. I analyze and follow things as an independent analyst. My question really is to the experts who are there on the panel. Is there any Islamic religious element in the current trend which are developing in the violent conflict that's taking place there in Ethiopia, particularly Tigray region? Thank you.
Clionadh, would that be something for you?
No.
No.
That's the answer.
I'll hand it over to Sandy then.
I had this discussion this morning with somebody in Addis. If one was looking as an international in Addis in 2013, as I was when I started as head of the political section in the EU delegation, we looked at internal strife and said, this is about religion. It's about Muslim versus Christian. Moving forward, post the 2015 election, the 2016 violence and following on, we then would have said this is about ethnic differences. And I think then in 2018, it became clear that there was then becoming a mixing of both ethnic and religious differences, including a split in the Orthodox Church in Oromia. So even the Orthodox Church splitting into two halves where people were prepared to throw quite sharp things at each other. So yes, that religious element has not gone away. In the immediate unrest following the death of the singer Hachalu Hundessa in late June, there was violence in many towns across particularly Western Oromia, particularly Eastern Oromia, down towards Arsi and down towards Bale, which had an Islamic element to it. And that element is still there, and it's still difficult to deal with. So there is an enduring religious element to internal unrest in Ethiopia, as well as the enduring ethnic element.
Can I just pop up there for a second? I think that it's very, very important that we understand a lot of these issues in terms of the political motivations that they have. Groups may organize around religion or ethnicity or region, but the issues that they are fighting over are very clearly about representation and balance within both local and national governments. And so while religion is certainly an ever-present factor within Ethiopia, as is, as I mentioned, ethnicity and geography, to link, for example, what's happening in Oromia with a variation both within the Orthodox Church and also within Islam, I think is maybe overstating what's happening here. Jawar Mohammed is incredibly popular, across Oromia, and he is a Muslim, and they believe that he in fact represents quite a lot of the local level, especially the young. And so I would hesitate to use any identity factor as the basis for this, rather than the political dimensions, which have really radically shifted for people in the last few years.
Yogendra, does this answer your question?
Oh, well, to a certain extent, yes, but I'm still wondering as to, I mean, even when you are trying to achieve a degree of political representation or political power, you still organize your political base along some identity. And as I can understand, perhaps religion is not such an important or such a salient sort of element of this identity formation, but it certainly exists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yogendra. So with basically time running, I'd like to focus on two additional topics here, which is one, the geopolitical implications of the current escalation, and secondly, looking forward, what the current escalation basically could mean in 2021. So I still see a hand being raised. Before including Francesco into our discussion, I would just quickly hand over the question concerning geopolitical implications over to Pat. Basically, what does it mean? I mean, we have been seeing Abiy Ahmed being relatively reluctant to international support, guidance, or any form of interference when it comes to the African Union or anyone else. Looking now into the actors, the regional actors, international actors being involved, and the swift taking of Mekelle last weekend, how does this conflict, what do you see, Pat, as potential geopolitical implications, and how does this conflict potentially affect interests of international and or regional actors in the midterm?
This is a very important element as well, given the success story of Ethiopia, the economic success story. And it has been driven largely by strong, very strong Chinese footprint in the country in the last 20 years. So there's a lot on the line for China and the Gulf states in this conflict, particularly the UAE. The UAE is not directly involved, despite its military pact with Eritrea, which could potentially get dragged into the conflict if it continues. But it has also stated that it will support friendly countries during the crisis. So what you can see is a protracted conflict in Ethiopia would put a brake on China's big ticket projects in the country, at least for the time being. Ethiopia is China's poster boy in Africa. That is a very important element. Largely economic, trade, investment, but behind the scenes, it does have strong political influence. That doesn't equate that it's going to get involved directly in the military conflict openly, but certainly very much behind what the government is doing. It is the same with the Gulf countries as well. You've got to look at some of the dynamics. Over 50% of Ethiopia's debt is currently owed to China, which is about $14 billion. That's a lot of money there. And Ethiopia's geopolitical position and its resource-rich land was the big incentive for international players. In recent times, we've seen largely the Asian players. And now a lot of these investments are now threatened by continued violence and potentially low-level risks as well as continuing. So far, China has not made any comments regarding the conflict, but has stated very categorically and strongly, along with all the African governments and the AU, is this is so far Ethiopia's internal matter. And I would say it expects the federal government to handle it effectively and accordingly. So in terms of the current situation, the geopolitical risks are there, but certainly very clear from China, the Gulf states, other African governments, they're not going to interfere until we see the humanitarian crisis is getting bigger and more unsustainable. That is the biggest risk, I would say, going forward as well. We could potentially see one of the biggest human crises unfolding in the Horn of Africa if they do not put a lid on this quickly.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Pat, for the explanation. Building on this, I do have a question for Clionadh. Looking now at the recent swift taking of Mekelle, what is the next step for TPLF? That's a question coming also from our attendees. What is to expect looking forward the next 5 to 6 months? Are we expecting a long-lasting battle here, or is it rather a low-level insurgency you from a conflict research perspective would be concentrating on? And what are the capabilities of the TPLF according to your assessment?
Thanks very much for the question. That's a tough one, in part because I think everybody's working with propaganda rather than real detail about the state of the fighting forces at the moment. But I would say that, that there's very little reason to believe TPLF propaganda at this point. Almost all of it, if not all of it, has been proved to be just that. And so, as I mentioned in my initial comments, the current kind of accepted line is that we should be going into an insurgency phase at the moment, or we should be going to an insurgency phase in the next few months. I would just caution that there are many insurgencies at the moment in Ethiopia. If people are looking for one, they don't necessarily need another one to start. But that the TPLF may be capable of that. They have. I would very much worry that the TPLF have proved that they simply cannot endure the way they have been. I think it was a comment earlier. And so both Tigray is being occupied, either in part or potentially wholly in the next few weeks and months, by Amhara administrators. And so the militias that operate potentially at the local level, as we talked about, are potentially our next front line, rather than TPLF forces somehow reorganizing themselves and operating as insurgency across the state. My biggest worry, I suppose, was that they would fund or support rather than be directly involved in some of the ongoing violence across the state, without necessarily having to fight themselves. But I think that we can start thinking about the post-TPLF age in Tigray and in Ethiopia and what that might look like. I mean, there's every possibility that the Prosperity Party is going to insist on having a Tigray Prosperity Party before the elections, and what that might bring is unknown. But I think that the TPLF force is in its last days.
Thank you very much, Clionadh. Well, and I just having a quick look at the time, and the hour has been flying through just incredibly. I'm still seeing hands being raised, so I would like to ask Francesco Gaglietti to join the discussion. If possible, just quickly state the affiliation and the panelist you would like to address your question to. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. My name is Francesco Gaglietti. I'm the head of a Rome-based political risk consultancy. I'm Italian. The question I'd like to ask is about the geopolitical implications of the unfolding crisis. We have heard a lot about China and how it is potentially affected by the state of play in Ethiopia, because it has many assets on the ground that could be impaired due to the course of events. I'm wondering where we are left with the other players in the Horn of Africa, because these days it's a pretty packed area. So China we know about, but how about Russia? They are settling down in Sudan, and how about Turkey? I'll leave it to you to decide who's the panelist to address this to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. If I'm understanding correctly, basically your question relates to the geopolitical implications also for the European Union, and how the very different actors and how we, or how Western actors relate to other competitors such as Russia, Turkey, or China. Is that correct?
Philip, not so much for European Union. It's simply that it's pretty clear what the interest of China is in Ethiopia. It's less clear what the interest of Russia and Turkey would look like. So that's what I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. So I'm looking into the rounds, and I would just, Sandy, do you have a perspective on what potential Russian, Turkish interests might be in Ethiopia, and if there are other actors we should keep in mind when assessing geopolitical implications?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk very specifically about Russian or Turkish individual desires in the region, or Iran's, or Saudi's, or UAE, etc. But what was clear over the period before the rapprochement with Eritrea was that the long-term standoff between Ethiopia and Eritrea was fracturing the Horn of Africa, the IGAD region in particular, and leaving gaps between the countries that outside actors were able to push their money or their weapons into, to lever those countries apart and to use the lack of a consensus in the region as to what they wanted themselves, to use that lack of consensus as a means of buying or forcing influence. And we saw that happen around the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. We saw it happen around Somalia, etc. So I think rather than saying what those individual actors might want, I would point to the danger of continuing instability in Ethiopia and the need for Ethiopia to resolve the current crisis and to move forward and recover some of the regional stability which is being shaken by what's happening. However much or not much the neighbors might like to think about this, most of Ethiopia's neighbors are leaning on Ethiopia. And if Ethiopia falls over, so do they. And so it's really important to restabilize Ethiopia, to allow Ethiopia to move forward through elections into some more elections in 2026, and to have that long-term view, and really to sort of build stability, because that stability will build stability for the region and will prevent external actors splitting the nations and using money for one nation, which buys a base, to produce an effect against another nation or to change a balance of power or influence in the region.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Since Thaker is quite knowledgeable when it comes to the regional dimensions as well, I'd like to just quickly bounce that question over to you, Pat, again. When it comes to the regional aspects, Francesco has been rightly putting out, there's the Russian ambitions in Sudan, building potential naval infrastructure up there. We do have the UAE in Eritrea. Looking at this actor landscape, how would you perceive this?
Thank you, Philip. I would say we've already touched on China. I would say China is the biggest footprint there in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. That's not going to change in any way. If anything, it's likely to get even stronger as part of the umbrella of the BRI project, One Belt Road project. So that's very, very important to remember that. In Turkey's perspective, it's a new entry. It's just dipping its toe into Africa, particularly East Africa and the Horn of Africa. Their interest is purely trade and investment at this point. They do not have any political ambitions in terms of getting involved in the region's conflicts. We've seen them enter Libya. It's quite a different game there. It is a different objective there. It's all about the Med and the gas pipeline and all of that. But it's also part of where Turkey has been heading in recent years. Erdogan's position within the region and elsewhere, which has been very much weakened. It is very much looking into sub-Saharan Africa for Turkish companies to expand their operations. In Ethiopia's case, Turkish companies have been looking at being part of the investment for infrastructure project and the manufacturing industries, basically establishing their operations in a number of the industrial free zones which the Chinese have built. So there's stiff competition coming there, but it's purely economic. For Sudan and Russia, I would say it would be a combination. Sudan is potentially going to be, if it moves to its more of a new normal situation in the coming years, it will be one of the most dynamic, untapped market. And it is with that view, you're seeing these new players coming on board as well. For Russia, yes, it's made its position quite clear. It has some military interests there. We've seen that recently taking place. But for Turkey, it's purely about economics and trade and investment, at this point at least. Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
Francesco, are you fine with that?
I'm very fine with it, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have reached the time. Clionadh, just any closing remarks from your side when it comes to regional actors, in this case then conflict actors, which might relate to the current situation and looking forward?
Thank you. I don't have much to contribute beyond the two panelists. Suffice to say, of course, that many, as the first thing to know is, as mentioned, Ethiopia is a linchpin in the region. It has to remain stable for the rest too, but the rest are also beset with their own problems, and they certainly don't want to get involved in Ethiopia's. And so that's the immediate, the near abroad, if you will. So I'll leave that there. Thank you.
So, thank you very much to all the panelists, Pat, Clionadh, Sandy. I've learned a lot, and I think we could have been continuing this for hours. I would like to hand over for one final last point. I would like to hand over to Pat before we close this webinar. Pat, would you like to make a final point?
Thank you. I would just like to add that, yes, the crisis will continue. Low-level insurgency will be there. We've already discussed a number of hotspots. But I think in the big picture, what you have to keep in mind is 70% of the population of Ethiopia is under the age of 30. And they're very much aligned with the PM's vision of one Ethiopia. They want jobs, they want stability and economic opportunities. Splitting up the country apart, they recognize there'll be a major political vacuum and limited resources. Very much aware of the neighboring country, what the results would be, South Sudan. It's a reminder what can happen. And this is perhaps, I would say, one of the main reasons why the states are demanding greater autonomy, but do not want to go down this road as well of completely separate states. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Pat. Hence, it's already 15:07. And although I would like to continue with you guys for the rest of the evening, I'll basically put an end to this webinar for today. I'd like to thank Sandy Waite in the UK, Pat Thaker in the UK, and Clionadh, as well as Brendan in Addis Ababa. Thank you very much for all your insights and perspective. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available shortly on the IISS.org website. And I hope you enjoyed the perspectives we have been sharing, the discussions, and I would like to hand out a big thank you to all the 3/4 panelists taking part in this discussion. I'd like to thank you. Have a great evening, and looking forward to seeing you soon again. Bye.